Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the second public engagement event about the refugee crisis hosted by the Center for Global Studies. I want to thank Jody and Jennifer and other colleagues at the CFGS for arranging these events. They take a lot of work to arrange, and for inviting me to moderate today's session. I'm the director of the Center for Studies in Religion and Society. The director of the CFGS, Oliver Schmidtka, is being run off his feet, as many of you know, trying to solve some of the problems we're going to be talking about today, so he can't be with us. Whether the frame of reference is Europe, the Middle East, North America, or even simply UVic, in the last few months, this crisis has been the subject of countless meetings, pronouncements, predictions, and demands for urgent public and political action. Some of you will remember that not long ago, controversies would erupt when a political figure used the wrong metaphor. If somebody referred to refugees as a flood that might swamp Europe, for example, dozens of scholars and journalists would rush to their computers to provide quite appropriate critical commentary. However, now the crisis has moved, I think, to another stage. And in this stage, very few people, even very few progressive folks, are vexed by an inappropriate or xenophobic aquatic metaphor or two. It's as though the sheer scale of the misery among the refugees and the powerful anxieties among so many in Europe have, for the moment, transfixed the public and focused our attention on matters more practical than semantic. That in itself is worth wondering about, and it says something about the current state of the crisis. While the current situation was both a long time in the making and something for which there is no simple solution, we still need to gather together in rooms like this to talk about the bigger world, to think about how we dealt with similar issues in the past, and to face, in the most imaginative way possible, the particular features of the present problem. So that's why we're here. I want to tell you a little bit now about who you're here with. Our speakers today include Nilesh Bose, who is a historian of modern South Asia, as well as a Canada Research Chair in Global and Comparative History. Among many interests, he has interest in global histories of religion, secularism, and nationalism. Of particular relevance to this panel is his interest in the history of South Asian migrations in the modern world and the relationships of race, law, citizenship, and state power. Penny Bryden, to Nilesh's left, is a professor of history. She's published books and articles on 20th century Canadian political history, constitutional history, and the relationship between different levels of government. All of the people she writes about have designed policies that affected refugees in both good ways and bad. Jordan Stanger Ross is an associate professor of history specializing in immigration to North America and the history of race. He is the director of Landscapes of Injustice, a collaborative 7-year project that focuses on the dispossession of Japanese Canadians during the Second World War. Dr. Adil Gatuni is an associate professor of management sciences, operations, research, and decision support systems at the Gustavson School of Business. In 2011, he was offered ministerial portfolios in Tunisia, which he turned down. However, he advised the Tunisian Prime Minister from November 2011 to March 2013. John Lutz, I should say before I give this introduction that he wrote it. John Lutz is the chair of the history department, and he is old. He is here partly because he is old. He is old enough to remember the Vietnam boat people and Canada's response to that crisis. He is here to remind us that with the knowledge of past histories, there are ways to help as individuals and as communities. So today we have 4 objectives. First, we want to set the crisis in its broader global perspective. That will be the task of Nilesh and Adele. We want, second, to provide some insights on the ways Canada, as a society and as a state, has responded to refugees. That will be the task of Penny and Jordan. Third, we want to open up a space for the audience to enter into a discussion with the panelists and among yourselves about the current state of affairs. That will be really our collective task. And finally, we want to reflect on what we might do now in a practical sense to respond to this crisis, and that will be John's final task. My job basically is to keep the conversation civil and to keep the speakers on time, and for that reason I'll be sitting here within kicking distance of the speakers when they pass their 7-minute time mark. So we have our work cut out for us, but fortunately the crisis has been front and center in the political arena and here on campus for some time now, so we should all be able to have, I think, an enriching conversation. So first, Nilesh, please join us.
Thank you to Paul for the introduction, and to Martin Bunton for the invitation, and for Jody for the organization, and everybody here and everybody on the panel for doing this. I just want to reiterate, as Paul had mentioned, that of course I'm not a specialist in Canadian history nor in Canadian studies, but I do have a few perspectives to share regarding refugee creation and its own history that relates to the situation in Syria, affecting of course the broader region, and particularly the internal and local displacements in Syria, with the overall approximate total being about 4 million people. Turkey being the largest, the state that's taking the largest numbers of people, approximately 2 million. Also states like Lebanon and Jordan nearby. And then the issue that has been in the news very recently about Europe and its own relationship to this crisis, the numbers that we have, about 800,000 that is being discussed, being admitted into Europe, being only a very small fraction of the larger picture. But comprehensible, I think, historically, within three sorts of macro global historical change, which I will speak of briefly today. One, the nature and meaning of sovereignty by nation states, and two, the nature and meaning of refugees and refugee creation and state-based responses, and then finally, the nature and history of migration around the world. And all of these issues, I think, combine into one basic element of this discussion, which I think is central, mentioned by Dr. Robert Fisk, who visited UVic last week, and mentioned basically decolonization. This is the issue that needs to be confronted front and center. And in the Middle East, this region that we call the Middle East today, is a region that I think is experiencing ongoing and yet to be fully conceptualized decolonization. And this is an issue that I will end with today. I'll end with a few thoughts about how I think decolonization is important to think with and think through when confronting this current and tragic world of refugee creation in Syria and elsewhere. And before beginning, I'd just like to point out a web resource that some of you may know of, but for those who do not, who wish to learn more about this issue from historical and socio-legal and social science perspectives on refugees, a range of freely accessible work has been made available on the OUP Oxford Public International Law website, which will be posted at the end of today. The opil.oup law website that has a range of material freely accessible to learn about this issue. So first, of these three issues of macro change that I think are relevant for us, one, sovereignty. Modern sovereignty in the current system of approximately 190 plus nation states today. It's a relatively new and definitively modern phenomenon born in the era of competing European empires in the late 19th century, in the era of highly aggressive and violent resource extraction in colonized regions of Asia and Africa primarily, and the creation of wealthy, powerful, resource-rich, and population-young settler and post-settler states from the 1880s up until the moment of World War I. The pivotal moment of World War I, when all of the various secret and not so secret agreements about this region we call the Middle East were hatched. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, for example, the Hussein-McMahon correspondences, the Balfour Declaration, again, some secret, some not so secret. All of these had been put forth at a time when modern states had already worked out the basis of their sovereignty. Some form of exclusion, some form of an exception, some definition of who would not be allowed to enter and who would not be allowed to become a citizen. And this, by the 1910s, was worked out from North America to the states in Europe that are now currently debating what to do about refugees. To think about North America, the idea of race was central, of course, to the notion of sovereignty in the early 20th century, from Canada to the United States to Mexico right before World War I. The biggest issue was who to exclude and on what basis. and excluding Asian migrants was a categorical issue that was shared across the Americas. And this issue in different forms on how to exclude people was the basis of sovereignty, also in territorial European locations that now are facing this issue. Territorial Britain, territorial France, the various ways to exclude people via race, via language, via religion, via literacy. These are various mechanisms that were put into place in the 19th century. In World War I, they were activated. At this pivotal moment, right at the tail end of World War I and then in the interwar period, discussions about refugees, definitions of them started to become a part of the public conversation in European and in global contexts. First discussed in the newly formed League of Nations at the tail end of the war. Organized confrontations of this idea of the refugee began to emerge and started to define the refugee retroactively through the experiences of groups that had both experienced and witnessed persecution, but also had been scattered throughout the world. So Jewish populations in the vast Jewish diasporas around the world, the Huguenot populations in different parts of Europe and different parts of Africa, different parts of Asia, were starting to be defined as refugees retroactively, based on this idea of either imagined or real persecution in the lifetime of a particular group. In the interwar period and through World War II, as we all know of, the rise of displaced people, and first in the hundreds of thousands in the 1930s, later reaching to millions in the 1940s, then cemented the definition of a refugee to be distinguished from a migrant. And this is an issue that becomes front and center in the 20th century. But in the mid-20th century, it was coming together that a refugee meant those who were escaping persecution. It is formally documented in the 1951 Geneva Convention on Refugees, which met and produced that first document in the early 1950s, revised slightly in the 1960s, and remains a primer to define who is a refugee and who isn't. Just a few more points I'd like to mention very quickly about the creation of refugees and the world of migration. One, refugees emerge at the nexus of sovereignty being redefined and changing migration patterns coming to the fore. So another area where refugees start to emerge. Colonial India and the impact of the partition of colonial India, the decolonization of South Asia, the creation of India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh produced millions of refugees based purely on their religious or national or local identities. And this then feeds into a new system of power after World War II of defining a refugee or a migrant. This is not fully clarified in the world of nation states after the 1950s. I have a few more things to say about that, but I can wait for the questions if there are. Just a few last points in the last few seconds that I'd like to mention here. Just to refer back to this world of sovereignty and migrants. So the idea of sovereignty is something that I think the modern world and the contemporary 21st century world has to face. What is the basis of sovereignty today in a world where migration is taking on different forms that had not been predictable from the past? And the kinds of migration that we see, which at times are based, of course, on economic hardships produced by both colonialism and post-colonial states, at the same time may also be related to the original definitions of refugees around persecution. Finally, rather than ask the question in 10 seconds of what can be done in particular terms, perhaps another question that could be asked is to work with and learn from refugees themselves. Prognostications about the future, of course, not the bailiwick of historians, but until and unless the 19th century imperial notions of sovereignty and the realities of global capitalism and migration today, sorry I couldn't talk about it in detail, but until those things are really understood, it is likely that the violence of the high imperial past will only replicate itself in the figure of the refugee or the migrant, threatening the assumptions of the world system. Okay, thank you.
We've got a stern taskmaster here and our leader. Start. Now, oh, we're already there. Let me begin by talking a bit about the foundations of Canadian refugee policy, which we like to think can be found in a appreciation of the humanitarian instinct. The Government of Canada has a statement to this effect on its website. Our compassion and fairness are a source of great pride for Canadians. Our values are at the core of our domestic refugee protection system and our resettlement assistance program. Both programs have long been praised by the United Nations Refugees Agency. I would like to suggest that humanitarian aid is not, in fact, a foundation of Canadian refugee policy, but economic gain is. And so it is that perspective that I am going to take, a simple, crass, and potentially un-Canadian suggestion of the foundation of our policy. I'm going to look to our first Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald, to find some of the roots of that. Migrants have come to Canada forever. But as a policy, immigration policy gets its first real articulation by John A. Macdonald. Let me step back a moment and comment a bit on terms here. The idea of refugees, as Neelish has discussed, is sort of retroactively applied to different groups within a larger immigrant constituency. And in Canada, the idea of refugee, in fact, doesn't have a formal place until the 1970s. So I will talk more generally about immigration and use those terms as Macdonald did. But the place where he puts immigration is within a broader conception of economic policy, the 1879 national policy that Macdonald surged back to power on after a hiatus in opposition, was a policy that married high tariffs with railway building and increased immigration. And so it's part of an economic policy that Macdonald conceived. The idea of marrying economic policy or trade policy in particular with the idea of immigration is interesting and points us to some things that I think we can, some similarities that we can tease out of the next 100 years. There's a lot of similarities in approaches to both trade and migration in the Canadian experience. In the first instance, the economy, our economy, is dependent on both trade and people. Where we have debated both of those issues has been the who. Who will we trade with, and who will we invite, or who will we allow to come? So there's one similarity. And the second one is a global similarity and a bigger who question. Who wants to trade with us, and that's been a problem for Canada sometimes, and who wants or is prepared to come. So there are who questions that plague or affect Canadian immigration policy from the beginning. I've got a quick snapshot of the numbers of immigrants. So these are just numbers outside the context of the Canadian population. What we can see from the beginning, at the beginning, and there doesn't, oh, there it is. It's very small. Anyway, at the outset of this period, we can see that the national policy that Macdonald articulates has a very slow effect. And so the national policies here, it jumps a bit, but it's a policy in a period of general recession. And it's also a policy that's articulated at a time when the who will come question is a serious one. The American West is still open, and immigration is much more directed towards the United States than to Canada. In 1896, Wilfrid Laurier comes into power. Simultaneously, the American West closes, and we see an enormous influx of immigration at this point. So in a period of economic boom here, immigration is high. The two are sort of chicken and egg creatures. The economy booms because immigration is high. Immigrants are coming because the economy is buoyant. This is the peak period that you'll still see politicians refer to or commentators refer to. 1911 is the highest year of immigration to Canada. More than 400,000 people come. It's a population of slightly more than 7 million, so it's almost 6% of the population arrives in 1911. Those are extraordinary figures, never again to be repeated. We'll see again in the 1920s the question of who, which I'll look at in a moment. Who will come to Canada? who will Canadians allow? And it's a limited answer that's given in the face of what appears to be a post-First World War economic slump. In the 1930s, a much more serious slump turns policymakers into retrenchers. It's not economic policy that's formulated, but rather depression policy. And the answer is no to virtually everyone. So we've got this extraordinary flat period here during the Depression, which then is followed by a post-war boom of immigration again. We see, with an economic undercurrent to all of this, the two rhetorical devices that are always used. On the one hand is the question of security, and I've got two quotes, both from the late 1930s and early 1940s. One, the first articulating the security question, which I had meant to hide the fact that it came in 1938 because it could easily be something that was articulated today. Ever since the war, efforts have been made by groups and individuals to get refugees into Canada, but we have all fought all along to protect ourselves against the admission of such stateless persons without passports. Similar arguments used today. And the second quote from Stanley Knowles, as human beings, we should do our best to provide as much sanctuary as we can for those people who can get away. The humanitarian instinct. Security and humanitarianism are the rhetorical flourishes that are glued on top of the economic basis. Some key moments. 1 minute left. You're right. I thought his clock was going a bit fast. Okay, some key moments. Again, retroactively considered refugees, Russian refugees in the late 19th and early 20th century. 1923, the debate over who, in a period of uncertain economic stability, sees Canada excluding Asiatic immigrants, immigrants from India, China, Japan, and Armenians in that group as well. 1923 to 1930 sees Mennonites as an acceptable who. 1938, one instance of the depths of Canada's refugee policy with the rejection of the St. Louis and the return to Nazi Germany of almost 1,000 Jews seeking refuge. The period from 1946 to 1962 sees 250,000 refugees, some of whom include the Ukrainian and Czech refugees that get a lot of attention today. In Canada, refugees and immigrants more broadly have created an economic boom. From statistics from the late 1970s, recent immigrants earn about 90% of the wages of Canadian-born 60% now, but from the late 1970s. And within 10 years of arrival, the earning rates are virtually the same. Second-generation refugees are more likely to attend university than the children of Canadian-born. All of these factors point to an economic boom with the admission of both refugees and immigrants. Canada is a country that is in need both of consumers and of taxpayers. And refugees form both of those constituencies. With an anticipated 1 million unfilled jobs in Canada by 2021, that tax base and consumer base is an economic argument that is in desperate need of being fulfilled now. Thank you very much.
Thank you again to the organizers of the panel and to the audience and to the fellow panelists. In the first years of the 20th century, in that period that you saw on the graph, Canada becomes a successful immigrant recruiting country. Canadians expressed concerns about immigrants that have never entirely disappeared. Migrants troubled Canadians of the early 1900s because of their alleged habits, beliefs, racial origins, sexual and social practices, and political cultures. How could people so different from us be assimilated into our society without transforming it for the worse? Purportedly unassimilable migrants continued to trouble Canadians in the decades that followed. In 1947, Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King told Parliament, "The people of Canada do not wish, as a result of mass immigration, to make a fundamental alteration in the character of our population. Large-scale immigration from the Orient," he told Canadians, "large-scale immigration from the Orient would change the fundamental composition of the Canadian population and would be certain to give rise to social and economic problems." In the 1960s, responding to decades of both international and domestic pressure, Canadian governments, both conservative and liberal, eliminated race as an explicit consideration in immigration matters and introduced new ways to separate desirable from undesirable, fit with labor market needs, educational attainment, language capacity, and so on. In the wake of this reorientation of Canadian immigration policy broadly, Canada also shifted significantly its approach to refugees, for the first time viewing people from outside of Europe as potential legitimate asylum seekers. Nonetheless, old concerns about assimilability persisted. At the outset of the 1970s, in the first wave of potential refugees from outside of Europe, virtually the first, Canadian officials considered admitting Tibetan refugees exiled from their country by Chinese invasion in the late 1950s. Officials fretted in their conversations of these potential refugees over the admission of people they considered primitive or medieval. In a memo to Cabinet, immigration officials expressed their concerns about the, quote, economic and psychological adjustments of people, quote, years behind Canadian culture. A federal committee reflected, Canada might be criticized for accepting refugees from a more primitive culture when we've not solved the problems related to our own native groups. Such concerns slowed and limited the process of admission, and eventually only 240 Tibetans were admitted into the country. So this was a small, incremental, and equivocal change, but one that began a major turn in Canadian policy. In 1972, Canada admitted 6,000 Asian refugees from Uganda. We welcomed 8,000 people from Chile in the wake of Pinochet's coup. 1,000 refugees came from Lebanon in the mid-decade. And most significantly, and much discussed today, at the end of the 1970s, some 69,000 refugees reached Canada from Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. These people came from places entirely outside of the universe of Canadian refugee policy just 10 years prior. The success of the programs in the 1970s, however, did not entirely quell long-standing concerns about the assimilability of immigrants. On August 24th, 1979, the National Citizens Coalition took out a full-page ad in the Globe and Mail articulating concerns about the government's admission of thousands of Vietnamese so-called boat people. Claiming that, quote, the best authorities estimated that each refugee would sponsor an additional 15 relatives, the ad warned that the admission of 50,000 refugees would in fact bring 700,000 Vietnamese migrants to Canada, creating, quote, a massive intake unlike anything Canada has experienced before. There is no way, continued the ad, there is no way that Canada can solve the world's refugee problem without destroying and completely changing Canadian society. Furthermore, the authors worried, with resonances to today, the small immigration staff in Southeast Asia is swamped with work and cannot properly identify and check the backgrounds of applicants, a situation that would allow, quote, agents from Hanoi to hide themselves among the refugees. At the time, the Conservative Minister of Immigration, Ron Atke, publicly charged the National Citizens Coalition of racism and proceeded with the policy. Sometime later, Stephen Harper himself assumed the presidency of the National Citizens Coalition before relaunching his political career. career. The 1970s are an important model to us and have been held up as such in commentary today. I think because political leaders admitted refugees even though many Canadians continued to harbor deep misgivings about those migrants. In the course of a decade, Canadian politicians distanced themselves from a long tradition of worrying about alterations to the fundamental character of the nation. Rather than stoking public fears, Canadian politicians, including in a Conservative government, joined progressive social groups in defending Canada's role as an asylum. Canada expresses its best self when discussions of refugees begin with human rights. Strong political commitment, and here maybe we'll disagree, to humanitarianism and the non-discriminatory principles of Canadian policy, often paired with, as Penny suggested to us, a recognition of the benefits that migrants can confer in Canadian society, were once sufficient to push aside deep unease about a potential refugee group. One hopes, or I hope, that they might do the same again today. Thank you.
So I will skip the introductory remark given actually the time pressure. So I came to this actually from a different perspective, and the question is why a business school is really interested in this and what you bring into this. So I would like actually to share with you some facts. So you know actually there is about 250,000 people that have been killed so far in Syria. 1 in 4 or 5 people in Lebanon are Syrian refugees. It is estimated that Iraq has lost close to 1 million people since the second invasion in 2003. I spent actually 4 years on the ground in the MENA region trying to get engaged after the Arab Spring. So let me tell you that we cannot really address the crisis if we don't try to honestly understand the context and the people. I would like to offer that we need to remember that it is all about the people. And it is time to change preconceived ideas about the region and engage in more collaborative attitude. I would like to say that refugees do not need charity, they need dignity. I suggest that we structure our answer to the refugees crisis around 3 moments or 3 questions: how to contain it, how to mitigate the consequences, and how to prevent it from spreading, as you will see in the next few slides. So any of these questions require deep comprehension and creative mindsets to develop new ways. And this is actually what entrepreneurship is all about, right? So if I would like to offer, and again going back to this map, a few facts about the region. So I will not go to Sykes-Picot and the colonization because actually my predecessor, I think they mentioned that. But I would like to offer to you a few facts here. The region GDP is about $3 trillion. We're talking $3 trillion US dollars. And the population is estimated 360 million. Most populations suffer from income inequalities, which are usually the consequences of what? Of injustice, corruption, extortion, tyranny. More than 20% of the population is really poor, with less than $2 a day to live with. It is a highly young population. There are about 110 million youth aged between 15 and 29. The right target for university recruits, but also for ISIS. It is a very well-educated population with a literacy level of above 70% in 2010 and school enrollment higher than 94%. So these people, most of them, they grow up with a post-colonial states that is centralized, authoritarian, welfare. It's the idea of welfare state controlled by despots supported by foreign powers. The state knows everything, the state decides everything. And on top of that, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is still fueling resentment. So my 5 top deductions from that is people rebelled against inequalities, injustice, corruption, and human rights abuses in their countries. That was so true in the case of Syria, if you remember the first few months. It was peaceful revolution. Mainly the rich with access to funds and those well-educated are able to leave their countries, pay smugglers, and make it to Europe. Youth are favorable ground for engaging in change movements, either positive or negative. So far, ISIS was able actually to lure them. However, collectively, we are not able to do it as successful as they did. The Arab Spring was a moment of hope for freedom, dignity, and social justice. Most people thought that the world will support them as it did in Eastern Europe or South Africa. Local population are not against us, if I say the West here. Make the test and offer them citizenship and you will see. So very quickly, I'm not going to stop, given actually the clock is ticking. So this is a very volatile place. So what this is showing you, these are major conflicts that are pressuring the population to move. Countries like Egypt, Tunisia are really vulnerable. Even Algeria is facing difficult situation right now. After bloody interventions in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya, where actually these, what happened actually, we left these actually countries to themselves and to regional powers. The West and Canada have sent very confusing messages in the case of Egypt, for instance. Canada contributed to the air campaign in Libya, but then what? What would happen now in Libya once an agreement would be signed? How the new caretaker government will address the country's priorities? Is it going to be like Iraq? Tunisia is another example of unfinished success, and I'm happy actually to elaborate more about that. So many are jumping in these death boats to cross to Europe, while some are joining ISIS. Canada needs to go back to a principled and peace-building international policy. Canada might be the deal broker that the region needs. The region needs a little bit more than the 3D approach, which is actually diplomacy, development, and deterrence or defense. I would like to say only 1 minute on ISIS, and I would like to share with you these. So it is puzzling actually to see that we are now surprised to see ISIS and its strength. Remember that it is the West that has dissolved the Iraqi army and the Ba'ath Party. The West supported Iraqi government that alienated the Sunnis minority. Just remember Fallujah. Extreme readings of Islam is not a fab, it's not something new. So if you go, the Khawarij, for example, which is actually one of the early days in Islam, was a faction like ISIS. Many Muslim scholars today will tell you that these are not Muslims at all. So moreover, when you look at ISIS, how they marched on Baghdad, Izzat Ibrahim al-Duri was the figure making the announcement of Baghdad liberation. This is actually Saddam Hussein's second man. Many reports are crediting former Saddam Hussein, military and intelligence officers, with ISIS operation successes in Iraq and Syria. Why we are not able to understand that? Why we are not able to stop the oil, the funds, and the military supplies? Why are they, how they are able to pay youth in Tunisia, and Tunisia is one of the big countries contributing to that, and move the money to them? Why is it possible that we are not able to disrupt this chain? So very quickly now on Canada and what you can do. So it is very well educated, generally not poor. They are young. They revolted against despots for freedom, dignity, and social justice. However, regional forces and international powers have decided to give them what? Misery, larger inflows of weapons, more bombing, more corruption. Most lost the little they had before the revolution. So I am so surprised by the negative role of Canada. Why Canada has chosen to confront Russia, for example? Why Canada turned its back on the Arab Spring Revolution? Why the Canadian international policy became so ineffective? I believe that the world and the region needs more the peacekeeping deal-broken Canada. Canada is sharing a border with two superpowers that have real influence in the crisis, and I think Canada has to re-engage. Canada has the credibility and reputation to make a difference, but maybe it is too late. So very quickly on these. So the refugees are good for Canada. History will show that Germany is making huge gains from this inflows, and I think my predecessor, they mentioned about the economic implication of that. Remember, they are well-educated, privileged people, and yes, there will be maybe some bad apples, but I think overall, they will make a huge contribution to our social system, to taxation, and so on. So just remember, as I said, what has been said about previous refugees. So just very quickly on what you see on the screen. So our school took a proactive and bold position to engage positively in the MENA region with local partners. So we created an NGO helping youth in the entrepreneurship path and leadership capacity building. We respect the pride, and these people are very proud, and the culture of these people, and we engaged with them in true partnership. We are helping hundreds of youth, and we are working with Libyan and Tunisian leaders. So Amin, this is actually the Arab word Amin, and leading the way initiatives might be a good example. So I really think, and that's I will conclude with this, that leadership capacity building and socio-economic empowerment, whatever to the refugees, if they are coming to Canada or the population there, is the key actually to start thinking about how we can do that. So we need to strengthen positive engagement, local communities, and help them start hoping again in a better future. Thank you.
So, thank you. Thank you all for staying pretty much on time. I see now why we didn't have Martin Bunton act as moderator, because I'm just way meaner than he is. So, thank you. So we have, before John Lutz comes up and actually solves all the problems in 5 minutes, we have 25 minutes or so for questions and conversation. I'm going to just abuse my role as moderator and pose very quickly 4 questions which you don't have to answer, but which I'm just sort of going to seed the audience with. And if you want to respond, you can, but otherwise we'll just go right to the audience. First question I would have is, what would happen, what difference would it make in the Canadian response if, A, the refugees were fleeing a natural disaster rather than a political one, B, the refugees were fleeing political unrest, but were all Belgian, Australian, or Japanese nationals, C, the refugees were not mostly Muslim, and D, the crisis wasn't unfolding right before an election? So, you can respond to those or not. So I'll just see if you guys have any quick responses for any of those. If not, we will take questions from the audience. No, no one dares, but, and then, yeah.
Well, I like your question, so let me, I've got a different approach, but it's the same kind of, maybe troublesome kind of a question. Imagine what our policies might be had First Nations managed to control, the early bunch of settlers here in a different way and ended up with sovereignty in our land. And now, had all these years we had, First Nations leadership. Those of us who've come later, figured out how to live within that. And what would a First Nations, sovereign First Nations led Canada be doing in a situation like this?
Nice.
If I may, just to address the question of being Muslim and so on, I think it's, I have seen it actually firsthand, and still, actually I mentioned that last time. I'm making a huge difference between the population and the people making the decisions, in especially the foreign affairs and other kind of places. And most of those people, especially in Europe, they are still actually motivated with 2 things. One is the post-colonial kind of relationship to that region. That region has been intervened upon, I think maybe you said last time, Martin, is the highest intervention that happened in that. And I believe actually personally that, I come from that region, and I believe personally that the reaction would be completely different if these people, they were different, they coming from, let's say, Christian or white kind of Caucasian, whatever kind of origins. And I gave the example of how, for example, Europe and the rest of the world stood up to supporting the revolutions in Eastern Europe, compared to the way how we dealt with the Arab Spring. Until now, actually, I take, for example, I mentioned Tunisia. Tunisia might become another kind of area where we'll see people coming from, or Libya, or those regions, because the relationship has been always kind of extractive kind of relationship. It was not kind of trying to build the institution and so on. So I believe still those who are making decisions are still motivated with the post-colonial kind of perspective, and they don't really consider those people as equal or partner.
Penny?
I'm going to give a shot at your questions. Let's pretend something else happened.
Thank you.
And you know, the most likely scenario is if some natural disaster occurs in the United States, because one of the things about Canada's position is we're geographically distant from most places. It's what makes us not Europe dealing with the crisis in the same way that Europe is now, is the geographical isolation. But we're not from the United States, so we can imagine a natural disaster, not a Donald Trump imposed, you know, political refugees leaving, but some kind of, you know, Mount St. Helena or something. And I think it would be nice to think that, I don't know, maybe it wouldn't be nice to think. I think Canada would be just as concerned about American refugees under those circumstances as we hear expressions of concerns about Syrian refugees or Vietnamese refugees, that they represent an upsetting of a balance that seems to exist in whatever the now is. So I think yes, that politics matters, and yes, it matters that it's colonizers as opposed to First Nations who are making these decisions, and yes, it matters about religion, but there are still other issues, I think, that transcend that.
Maybe just to take a somewhat different, I mean, I guess in some ways, I think, you know, what I've been trying to present pushes back against these imaginings of a radically different context in which we might have a more generous policy towards refugees. I think, to me, it's not hard to imagine our society with all of its warts, and that's what I was trying to suggest about the 70s. In fact, having a more generous policy, I think it's a small change of political will, I think, in a context where you know, we still have the various unresolved tensions of our society, but we determined that we can admit 70,000 Syrian refugees. I don't think that world is so far from our own, and maybe it is just a change of government.
I didn't say that.
Where you could see a where you could see a shift, a significant shift, at least in the lives of those thousands of people, not in the scope of maybe the global problems that will be confronted, but in the lives of 50, 60,000 people. Right?
Indeed. Oh, sorry, yeah, go ahead. In fact, it doesn't amplify, but it picks up in the...
Okay. Thank you. So thanks to the entire panel. But my questions are in particular to Nilesh and Professor Gittoni. Thanks for that, bringing in that post-colonial perspective, which is much needed in this kind of discussions. So, I mean, to Nilesh in particular, because you were talking about this moment as something which is longue durée and something which is trans-historical, something like a century-long process. So one question is to how to think about race as central to all these formations that you were talking about. Second is also a larger question about language itself, because the very idea of crisis, as I think it's also very important for us to think about whether crisis is the most appropriate term to describe what is happening, particularly in the context of you describing it as a century-long kind of process. And also a very important caution from the most European of philosophers, Derrida, who said in 1990, soon after the fall of the Iron Curtain, that it's one of the most unproductive categories in European philosophy, and he was quoting Valery to Heidegger to Husserl, etc. So it's really important for us to think about that. And also because you were describing the contemporary moment in Syria and the Middle East and everyday lives of people. So I was just thinking that is it worth to have a category like the crisis or something like someone like Susan Berlind would describe as crisis ordinariness, which would help us probably to think about the contemporary moment and lives of people and the central registers of everyday life, which is as it is unfolding in Europe. So these are two questions, largely posed for both of you and, of course, the entire panel, as I'm sure that you also have things to.
If we can take Emmanuel's question right now, too, and then we can respond to it.
Thank you. So my question is to Nilesh, but also I'd like Adele maybe to address it.
Can you speak up a bit?
Yeah. So the frame that you use of colonialism is something that I find actually much more complex than it seems. And the reason why I find it complex, that as much as I think it works when we're looking at Canadian reaction to First Nations, Bud's question, where I believe that the Canadian state is still in a relationship of colonialism with First Nations and has not changed since the Paris Treaty's view of how you colonize a people. I think that the relationship between Europeans and all of the Arab countries is very different. And I see this through the frame of Frontex and all the neighborhood policies, which are much more subtle, complex, because they bring together human rights, educationals, economic development, as well as security issues all together. And so I want us to be very careful when we use colonialism to actually explain, for instance, the flow of asylum seekers, of refugees. And I want us to be also very careful when we do this and we actually look at Europeans and say, well, yes, they're still old colonialist states who don't understand what's going in the Middle East. Yet they attract the middle and high middle class of all of those countries, which, by the way, do not migrate to other, much more stable and authoritarian Muslim countries, which have completely backed out, completely turned their back on, and do not need the protection of European states. Saudi Arabia is a good example. Iran is another good example. Why are those people not moving, in the region? Why is it that they're going to Europe? So why am I doing this and why am I asking these questions? I don't want the room and I don't want us, Westerners, to feel guilty about a history when actually I think that the position of the German government is exemplary today worldwide and is turning in a way which is almost historical, trying to turn the corner to the Holocaust. I'm not saying that they're turning it, but I'm saying they're trying to. They're trying to welcome very different people into their into their heart, basically. And even though it's a very difficult debate in Germany, even though it is very far from being gained, at least Angela Merkel, she put it as a policy proposal to the rest of the EU. And when you look at the tense discussions between the EU leaders, you get a sense that it's far from being won.
Thank you. These questions actually fit together pretty well. So you guys want to intern responding or I'm not sure.
Okay, I'll try to be concise here. Thank you for the questions. I'll take them in order. Bindu's questions about race, about the term crisis and everyday life. So I think that when it comes to considering the history of race, so race as an idea, as a part of science, as it emerged in the 18th and 19th centuries, and then its relationship to state power, has its own genealogy that we can perhaps track and think about, because I think it's very relevant to this exact discussion of how a state will determine who is eligible to enter and who is eligible not to enter. So I think it should be front and center. I think that, as I mentioned at the very end, changing notions of sovereignty will then impact the way we see that as a constitutive force. So I think that I do agree, the way you read what I was trying to say, that this is a much longer process, that late 19th, early 20th century, as it was coming into being, we're still living in the shadow of those ideas that were put into place at that time. But actual empirical world has changed radically, I think, speaking to the second question about how people move and how people understand themselves, how they understand their daily life. So, I mean, I think that that core idea will transform. And so I guess maybe speaking to Paul's question, that I don't think it's a settled question. If the racialized identities were different, how would states interact? I think it is quite different than it would be 100 years ago, but we're still trapped in that language. The language of that moment is still coloring the discussions that we have. And I think about crisis too, I think as you're pointing to, the term crisis that has been used, it's used from the point of view of nation states in the West that are very powerful and wealthy, and for them this is perceived in that sense. If we look at the perspectives of people who are, in a sense, victims of the world system from the World War II period onward, this is nothing new for much of the world since World War II. So it's not a new thing to think about. It's a new thing to think about for states that have to deal with changing conceptions of sovereignty. Just very quickly, I don't want to take too much time, but the point about colonialism and the Gulf states, I didn't get to mention, I wanted to, that yes, I 100% agree. It must be acknowledged very clearly that very wealthy, resource-rich Gulf states have not done anything in this particular context. But the other point that I wanted to make, how are these Gulf states built? UAE, cities like Dubai, Abu Dhabi, built almost completely on migrant labor that has absolutely no stake in the citizenship regimes of those societies, mostly from South Asia. And this is something that the Gulf is able to do because of a changed, I would say, global capitalist world from the 1970s onward. Finally, about colonialism, I do think it's quite relevant. It's not relevant in the direct let's say, causal forces that we could identify, but I think that from World War I onward, because there has been no chance for democratic governance in the region that we call the Middle East by the residents of the region, that is a direct result of empire in the region, and that is the origin point of it. However, as you mentioned, I do think the relationship to the Arab world is different in Europe than it is to the indigenous peoples of this continent, but it is still living within this framework that we know of from 100 years ago, and that will have to be what has to change, I think, for the future, for there to be less violence in the future.
If I may, just maybe a few thoughts here. When I'm talking about the post-colonialism kind of regimes, and so it's not a question of really guilt, but it's a question of really how the people there, they feel and they live. So for example, most of the borders, they have been drawn in this post-colonialism kind of era. The Kurds, they have been actually split between 3 countries, and that is really a huge reason for the instability. But not only that, the relationship that most of the European countries they have maintained with their former colonies was really to support these despots, because a lot of them would not really survive a long time if they are not supported by mostly Western but also Eastern kind of powers. Fast forward to today and see, for example, what happened in Egypt, and we have really to read that, and how something like a coup was not really opposed, but not only that, actually without the external support, Sisi will not survive. France is now selling its warships to that regime, and that's actually what people see on the ground. I have been, as I said, there, and I have seen how extractive the relationship is still there. So it was not kind of now partnership. Talking about Germany, and I can say the example of Tunisia that I lived through, and I have been in contact with the Germans, for example, in Tunisia. They have completely different approach, and maybe because they did not colonize that region as well. That is, we have really to look into that and say maybe there something that we have really to look into. So most of the people they were looking, so talking about the inflows and why they go, they choose to, most of them to go to Europe and so on. Again, this kind of relationship, because in the beginning it was extractive again. Because when Europe, after the World War II, tried to rebuild itself, actually it pumped a lot of the migrants from that region to rebuild. Even during the World War II, a lot of the people from that region were actually what you call in French the chair à canon. They were in the front rows, actually to be able to be part of the liberation and so on. So, and those generations of people continued actually to have that kind of connection with Europe. So people, remember what I said, people revolted for the freedom, dignity, and social justice. All the other Arab countries, in the GCC countries, and Iran and so on, they're not offering that freedom and so on. So for a lot of the people, and this is why there is schizophrenia, maybe that's part of the part of the personality there. People, they like having this opportunity and the freedom and so on of the West, but they feel that they are not treated as equal. That region, and I will finish with this, has also to do some kind of soul searching and read also its own history, because the relationship of that region with other colonies, Sub-Saharan and so on, and Africa and so on, it was not also great, because of slavery and other kind of thing. But this is what people on the ground, they feel, in my opinion. So this is why I mentioned post-colonialism, because that's most of the people today, they live it in those states.
So Krista, and then Hani, and then one more. Three of you.
I would like to make a point. It seems to me that the biggest problem we face in terms of bringing refugees into Canada, we have to address our government, and I think that we are such a short while before the election plays a strong role in it. There were no problems when we brought in the East Asian people from Uganda. They were a different race, and they were Muslim predominantly, Ismaili. When we brought in refugees, there were about 5,000. When we brought in refugees from Kosovo, they were predominantly Muslim, Sunni, and we brought in 5,000 or 6,000. So I don't think it is so much a religious or racial problem as it is a lack of will of the current government to bring in refugees. It wouldn't hurt us at all if we rented a couple of large cruise ships and brought in 4,000 times 2 or 3 cruise ships of migrants, or refugees, not migrants, of refugees, or plane loads. But we don't have the political will, or our leadership doesn't have the political will. It's not a question of race or religion, in my opinion.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. There's a tendency in some academic circles and in the media in general to portray the push or the resistance to the immigration and the refugee waves, not floods, coming into Europe and propose to come into Canada as racism, xenophobia, conservative ideology. But these fears, whether they are right or wrong, are real. And I think it's incumbent upon the academic circles to study that and try to understand why this is happening. Why is there such a resistance against a legitimate need of these refugees to find safety? These refugees are not going there because suddenly they want to have a better job and better pay, because they are running for their lives. So there is resistance. Why? We have to understand that, instead of pushing it under the political correctness carpet and say this is racism or this is xenophobia. No, it isn't. It has more to do with the situation we have here and in the West than just a simple question of racism or xenophobia. Thanks.
Oh, just picking up on various points about the role of race in the questions of someone's phone is ringing in the current crisis, but in the longue durée crisis that Nilesh so eloquently pointed to, particularly recently in your answer, Nilesh. Where I think we do see race written kind of without question is in the lack of attention that's paid to the massive displacements in Sub-Saharan Africa. So today, the UNHCR has 15 million people of concern, either internally displaced or externally displaced refugees in Sub-Saharan Africa. Adele's map cut off across Sudan, but so many of those refugees are in South Sudan. in Eritrea, in Central African Republic, and so on, or they emanate from there to the various camps around the region. And it seems churlish to bring it up now and say, what about all those other refugees? And I'm, involved in a history department initiative to sponsor a Syrian family, so I'm very much concerned about and committed to attending to the dire needs of Syrians, displaced Syrians at this time. But I'm at the same time profoundly uncomfortable that we virtually ignore Sub-Saharan African refugee crises of long standing and of acute moment right now. And I wonder whether the panelists have any thoughts about whether this is just further, I mean, it's not just Canada that ignores these, the entire European community ignores these crises. But if you have any thoughts about whether this is further evidence of Canada's turning away in recent years from our former policies to assist the most hard-pressed nations in Sub-Saharan Africa, or what kind of context you might see this complete deafness to what's going on in terms of Sub-Saharan African refugees.
All three of your questions were also nicely linked too, so go ahead, guys.
Well, what would I say? I mean, I guess in response to Elizabeth's last comment, presumably the ways in which refugee situations generate attention and fail to generate attention is complex in origin. I think there can be hope that attention, that it's not a zero-sum game, that is, it's not kind of an historical answer, but maybe a forward-looking answer that as a, again, you see in the 70s as Canada becomes attuned to the question of refugees broadly, there's kind of people from a range of origins whose claims are brought to the fore in Canadian policy, and maybe there's a chance that kind of concern about refugees here spills over to a broader reconsideration of the number of refugees Canada can absorb and so on, those types of questions. I'm not sure, certainly that, I mean, and Laura Matakora, who I cited in my slide there, who has written on the 70s in this way, she had a recent editorial in the Globe and Mail about that image that captured so much attention in Canada, and an image of boat people that captured attention a generation earlier. And certainly, I mean, I think that image, the fact that it had Canadian and BC connections, the way in which it was timed in relation to the election, and all of those things, I would think, contributed to the attention that Canadians are devoting to this refugee situation, right? So, if things had aligned differently, maybe we'd be just as silent around this issue as we have been around Sudan and so on.
Does anybody else want to respond to the cluster we had?
Maybe quickly. So, I think Napoleon has said actually people are moved by fear or greed. So I think, again, talking about the Sub-Saharan Africa, and I think, yes, I agree with you, there are a lot of, I think, problems there. Just remember, actually, the Boko Haram and the girls from the schools, and it was on top in the news, and even actually the First Lady in the U.S., actually, she was posting a picture of her saying, free the girls, and so on, and then what happened? And you see this actually, what is really moving, and this is why I go back to the question of, are we pushing our governments and representatives to have more principled kind of approaches to these international relations, or is it simply fear or greed? And that is when you get to those kind of circles, and I had, as I said again, an opportunity to touch a little bit of that to understand some of it, and mostly it's fear or greed. So fear push us to take action, or there are opportunities there actually to whatever extract. So I think, but the good news in Africa is now surging. 10 of the top growing countries, economies are now in Africa. So Africa, I suspect, is going to be the next big development frontier. So talking about the race and so on, I think you're right, and this is why I personally made the difference between those who are in offices, like whatever, in these foreign affairs or other, and the rest of the population. The rest of the population is not well educated. They are motivated by, again, the same thing. Actually, is it going to help me or is it going to be threaten me? But those in policy makers, and they are short-sighted, unfortunately now, so you get to these kind of policies. So people are really concerned about making decisions that will get them the next gain, whatever that, political or whatever. So nobody is thinking about the long term. I mentioned, for example, Iraq. Nobody actually thought what happened after, let's say, the liberation of Iraq. What is going to happen now in Libya if they get to an agreement? And that's when you get now to a new government that is not going to be able to address the issue. So that's where you get to. So I mean, and I agree, this type of problem needs to have a little bit of holistic approach. And I think, at least in the region, we have to look at how Canada can play a role to bring EU, MENA regions, and other superpowers to a dialogue and see a longer-term kind of solution rather than just short-term.
All right, now we have an opportunity for, I think, one more cluster of questions. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and then make them brief questions, please, and then the panel will have a chance to respond, and then John will fix everything. Sorry, right at the very back of the black.
I'm just thinking how I can make this brief, but I think there's two kinds of racism we need to be concerned about. The racism of Canadians that, if that's what it is, that don't want refugees to come or are concerned about that. And let's just leave that aside for a moment. The racism, and it's more than racism, it's bigotry in general that concerns me the most, is Canada's condescension toward other points of view in general in the world, and demonization of other countries like Russia or the Syrian government. Is the Syrian government all bad? And taking sides and bombing people. I mean, this is about lives at the end of the day. So what really disturbs me is Canada's role internationally, more than, frankly, the concern about are we racist or not, although that is a concern. And I think Canada needs to stop taking sides and making these pronouncements and bombing people or going along with NATO's bombing of people, whether it's in Yugoslavia or Syria or Iraq or wherever it is, Libya, and just start behaving like a civilized country, because I don't think we are at the moment.
Thank you. In the corner. Yeah. We're gonna take the 4 questions together, and then they'll have a last opportunity to comment.
Thank you. I'm not academic or a student. I'm not academic or a student, but I'm refugee, so I want to make a comment. And one point is someone mentioned the Sub-Saharan Africans, and that's very important. And I will link to someone else who mentioned why are people going to Europe rather than staying in those regions. There are a lot of forgotten refugees in Jordan and in other countries who are African descent. And the reason why people move is because in those countries there is a lot of rights, such as the right to permanent residence and education. And everyone wants safety and dignity, as you mentioned, and that's why people travel. It's not a matter of responsibility. But for me, coming back to, in terms of as Canadians, what we're doing, what I have realized is that before the crisis happened, I came to Canada in 2012. The Canadian context of resettlement has changed. It was global, then it became specific population, specific region, and they were targeting certain places. And the UNHCR sent a recommendation of the 10 top countries that really need resettlement from Horn of Africa and other countries. Those countries were included Somalis and Afghans, and the Canadian government rejected those countries in 2012. And you can find through the Canadian Council for Refugees website. So to me, that's where I understood that we were shifting away from the Muslim refugees. So now today we see the crisis and how are we responding. If I go to the private sponsorship, And a journalist had an article 2 days ago, 90% of private sponsored refugees are either ethnic or religious minority. That again shows you not the government, but also in the Saha private sponsorship groups are also shifting. So to me, as a black, as a Muslim, as a refugee, it's clear there's prejudices and racism in the system. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, second last question, the pale blue shirt in the middle.
Thank you. My question is for Adele. Adele, I'm the former Canadian Defence Attaché. I've just left Turkey, so I spent the last 3 years there. You know, Canada's compromised its position in the region. We had a Canadian general in command of the NATO mission that undertook the bombing of Libya under the guise of UN Resolution 1973. We worked from the very beginning to undermine the Syrian government in any way we could. And I'm not sure what role we can actually play now in the region as an honest broker or a peacemaker, especially with Russia now taking the initiative in the region.
Okay, last question in front.
Thanks. I'll just be brief because I want to know what's going to happen next. If we're going to get a new government, and let's hope and pray we're getting a new government on October 19th, and then we might get our country back, but let's get it back on a better track. And I would like to hear from you what you think we should be making sure that the new government is going to do and enact. Because what we have is now is a divisive right-wing government that really doesn't care about foreign affairs. It takes on Israel as the Messiah and doesn't look at anything else and is racist to the extreme. And so we need a new way forward. And it's going to take some time and it's going to take some action. So all of you are experts and many experts in the room. I'm looking to you to help out. And so we, the public, can show leadership. Thank you.
That's an excellent final question. Does the panel want to respond first before we turn it over to John? There were 4 really good questions.
I'm going to wait. So.
There was one directed to you.
Yeah, but okay, so.
If I could just say a couple of words about the role of government and how that has changed over time, that I think we're seeing now. I talked about the significance of the economic perspective on refugees and on immigration more generally, but we've gotten to a point where the humanitarian element, which has always been an important argument that presses government to do things, that humanitarian argument is obviously still strong, still has a place. It's just it has a place in rooms like this, as opposed to being reflected in government, which is, as in all areas, downloading responsibility to a public. To do things on a private level that used to be the sorts of things that were done on a collective level through the renting of cruise ships or airplanes or and bringing people here. So it is a shift that we can see in so many other areas than simply immigration policy, and one that at least 4 years ago a majority of people thought was a good idea, but maybe on October 19th they will not. So not answering anyone's question, but making a nod to a few people who said things.
Somebody want to respond? Adele?
Yeah, I can just address maybe the last one and then go back. I agree with you, and I think I have also spent some time with defense and going back to at least what Canada was really proactive with, this 3D kind of approach and the whole of government approach and so on. Unfortunately, that was left behind. And you see, when you see soldiers like Hillier and Dallaire coming out and saying we can do more, I think that shows how Canada has lost its soul internationally. And I think the remedy to that is really a strong leadership in Canada that will send a message that things are changing. Yes, continue the same leadership is not going to do anything. It's going to continue in the same route, same route. Unfortunately, I would say amongst the three leaders that are pretending to the position of prime minister, I don't see anyone with the ambition of Lester B. Pearson, for example. And that's where we collectively, and now as now elite, we can put the pressure and try actually to ask that these leaders, they have now to step up, because as I said, Canada, the world needs a lot of Canada, and Canada, at least how it was in the beginning. So I think new leadership, pulling back actually from military action and engaging in real kind of negotiation and so on, and broken deals and being facilitator in a lot of these discussions, and bringing people together, bringing Putin and whomever, actually the President of the United States, and pushing for some kind of long-term kind of agreement. I think that could be the way to go. As a long-term, I think, talking about now locally here, I don't believe that what you're going to be doing to the refugees, 2,000 or 10,000 or 50,000, is going to make a huge difference on the ground. That is simply that we're going to feel good when we go to bed and say, oh, we have done and we have sponsored some leadership, some refugees. But I believe is what we can do actually to help resolving the issue on the ground, because otherwise, as you can see the map, it's not stable and it can explode anytime in any region. And the flood will be, as they are using it, is going to open, the gate will be open, not because people, they want that, but it's they don't have the hope. So I go back is we need to help empowering, as an institution, empowering people, building capacity, engaging with them, partner with them, understanding, and helping the Canadian population to understand and educate our leaders. So that's in a nutshell.
Thank you. Now, so sit tight, because what you've all been waiting for is a solution to this thorny problem from John Lutz. Thank you.
So, like all of you, I've been watching this crisis build over the spring and summer with increasing alarm and concern, and then ultimately a bit of embarrassment about how little our government was doing to respond, and also a feeling of helplessness that I'm sitting in my living room every night, my comfy chair, watching the news and watching this stream of human misery flow through the airways. And people are telling me on the news that this is the worst refugee crisis since the Second World War. Well, I introduced myself by saying I'm old. I've seen more than half a century of history. I didn't live through the Second World War. I didn't see that crisis. This is the largest refugee crisis of my time. This is the largest refugee crisis of my life. Make no mistake, this is a big moment in world history. And make no mistake, it calls for an extraordinary response, I think. So, I'm feeling helpless. I'm feeling at home. What am I going to do? So there's a couple of things I think we can do. I don't have the clicker. You got it there, Jody? Where is it? The clicker's gone away. So, all right. So what can we do? Well, we can all give something. Well, I shouldn't say we can all. Many of us can give something. And you, Vic, I'm really proud of you. Vic has really stepped up, I think. Universities don't have to take a position on these kind of things. Only a few Canadian universities have really come out publicly and said, this is our responsibility as a civic institution, and UVic has offered to, do a bunch of things. I think they've put $300,000 from the general budget into bringing more student refugees through the World University Service Canada. They're, very good. They're offering to put some money into English language training for the refugees when they come, and they're offering to match every dollar you give to UVic for this initiative up to $50,000. So if you have $1, UVic will double it. So if you want to, if that's your interest, that's one way you can help. The other way you can help is the refugees that we see in Europe. Those are the ones that are really on the media. We don't see the ones who are in the camps in Syria. We don't see the ones who are in the camps in Lebanon and Turkey. And those people desperately need help too. And the UNHCR is horribly underfunded. And so are the other agencies. So you can give money to the UNHCR. Our government has been inactive and sluggish, but one thing it has offered to do is double the contribution of your dollars to the main charitable organization. So back on this slide, CanadaHelps.org will take you to this website, and if you give money, I think, to any one of those organizations, but certainly the major ones, our government will double it up to, quite a large sum, $100 million.
Is UNHCR included in that list?
Yes, it is, yeah. So many of us have something to give. There are other ways to help too, going this way. Oh, Jody, help me. Batteries died. Something has happened. There we are. Well, now we've gone past it. There we go. Okay, so what can you do? Well, you can sponsor a refugee family if you like. And Elizabeth Vibert, my colleague, has mentioned that in the history department, I think there's 16 of us, plus a few emeritus faculty and a couple of adjuncts who have decided to get together and sponsor a refugee family. And so we are fundraising for that. And let me ask, how many of you were here on our talk a week ago Friday? Put your hands up. So those people who were here a week ago Friday, I said, if you do nothing else and you want to feel better when you leave the room, you can make a contribution to help us bring a refugee family in. So I brought a hat to pass the hat here. And I brought a particular hat because it reminds us, I think, that most of us are immigrants. Most of us are parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, or ancestors. We're either immigrants or refugees. So I'm going to be standing by the door. And when you leave, if you feel like you want to make some contribution, this will go to helping the history department, not the department, but colleagues in the department, bring in, well, we can raise some money for the history department too. So, and there are two methods to bring in refugees. Any 5 of us can get together and sponsor a refugee family through an application process to the government, 5 or more. And so that's a possibility. Another possibility is to work through a local agency that already has a sponsorship agreement with the Canadian government to do that. And there's several local agencies, the Intercultural Association, there we go. The Anglican Diocese of British Columbia. I don't think WUSC is bringing people in through these kind of agreements, but they're bringing in student refugees. So if you're interested, these links will help you track down those people, and I think this will be up on the Centers for Global Studies website. So you can find more about how to bring in refugees. Families. As I said, the history department is going to work through the Intercultural Association, it looks like, to bring in at least 1 family in. And Elizabeth raised the question, well, why Syria when there are so many other needy people around the world? Well, I think, and I think this was one of the answers to Jordan, I've never sponsored a refugee family before. I've never been inspired to sponsor a refugee family until I saw the misery coming through the TV channels. You know, I'm expecting that having done this, and if it worked well, we might try and organize again, and again, and again. So in that way, I think there is hope that this will spread. Change. Everybody's talked about change. Vote for change in the federal election. Make it, I mean, it is an election issue. Make it more of an issue. And probably even more important is what happens after the election. The pressure has to stay on. So when I passed the hat or stood there at the door a week ago Friday, we had the same kind of conversation. The people in that room generously gave $200. That's a good contribution to a month's rent for a refugee family. So I'm going to challenge you guys. See if we can double that contribution on your way out the door. So there are lots of things we can do, and I tell you, we are not helpless, even though the government, I think, wants to make us feel helpless. There are many things, even though the scale of the crisis is overwhelming, there are things that you and I can do, I tell you, the only thing you can't do is nothing, because you'll feel bad if you do nothing. When, you know, my father's generation, they're asked, well, what did you do in the war? Well, our grandchildren may ask us, what did you do when the world turned upside down and the refugee crisis of 2015 started? And whether or not they ask that question, I think we're asking that question of ourselves. What can we do? We can do something. Thanks very much.
I told you. Huh? All right. Please join me in thanking the panelists and Jody and Jennifer for organizing it. Thank you. So, and stay tuned to the website of the CFGS, and if there are other events around this theme, you'll see them there. Take care, everybody. Have a good weekend.